This is Rummy's Corner. Good evening, boxing fans, and welcome back to part 2 of our by-decade scoring experiment. Today we're going to take a look at the Cruiserweight division, and we'll be utilizing Ring Magazine's rich archive of historical rankings in order to try and objectively determine the top 10 Cruiserweight boxers from each decade. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of data to work with. Ring Magazine began doing annual rankings for the Cruiserweight division in 1983, but then they inexplicably stopped the practice in 1987 and 1988 before resuming annual rankings in 1989. So because of the gap, we're going to start with the first full decade with a complete data set of rankings, the 1990s. At the conclusion of 1990, these were the top-rated cruiserweights according to Ring Magazine. Jeff Lampkin was the first name on the list, so we're going to give him 10 points. Next on the list is Robert Daniels, and he gets 9 points. We continue downward until we get to Richard Mason, and he receives 1 point. There happen to be 10 names on this list, but sometimes Ring Magazine has 11 names on their ratings. But for our purposes here, we will only be concerned with the top 10 names listed in instances where there are 11 names. If we go through this and do this for every year from 1990 through 1999, our final results look like this. Anaclet Wamba topped the list with 46 points, driven by the strength of his strong ratings throughout the first half of the 90s. Al Cole finished with a respectable 40 points, just edging out Nate Miller, who had 39. Then we have Dominguez and Chiozo tied at 36. And looking at this list, there aren't really any superstar names jumping out from that period. And this is something that has long plagued the relatively new weight class. Moving on to the double O's, Jean-Marc Mormick finished first with 51 points, the first cruiserweight to break the 50-point threshold. Then we have O'Neal Bell right behind him with 48. Steve Cunningham was right up there near the top of the list. And then there are a couple of notable names that are absent here, James Toney and David Hay. And that's one of the things about the Cruiserweight division. Whenever you have a cruiserweight who emerges as the king of the weight class, they almost never remain cruiserweights for long. The temptation to try their luck at heavyweight for bigger purses and greater glory, it's just too much for these guys to resist. No David Hay on the list because he was after a heavyweight payday with a Klitschko. Earlier in the decade, the same thing happened with James Toney. Vasily Jarov was one of the greatest cruiserweights at the start of the 2000s, but he left to try his luck at heavyweight as well. Tomas Adamek started competing in the weight class just the last 2 years of the decade, and he also ultimately abandoned the division to test the heavyweight waters. Moving on, while the current decade is not yet complete, through the end of 2017, the list looks like this. Marco Huck is on top with 58 points, which happens to be the highest point total for any cruiserweight since 1990. Denis Lebedev was right behind him with 56, marking this as the only time the two cruiserweights broke 50. Cunningham is down tied for 10th, and again, we have a situation where a cruiserweight moved to heavyweight. And with Cunningham, he was a long-time cruiserweight before making the jump, but even he wound up doing it in the end. Alexander Usyk already finds himself tied for 6th, and his opponent for the upcoming World Boxing Super Series final is Murat Gassiev. And that fight happens in May. Both of these guys are already on the list, but you have to wonder how long these guys will realistically stick around at cruiserweight before jumping up to heavyweight. But looking at the guys at the top here, Marco Huck and Denis Lebedev, these guys were viewed as elite-level cruiserweights according to the scoring criteria, and the main reason for this is that they actually both competed as cruiserweights for an extended stretch of time, during which they were consistently viewed among the very best in the weight class. This scoring exercise isn't about head-to-head realities, and it isn't about hypothetical speculations. It's really designed to try and objectively award longevity within a single weight class over the course of a very specific time interval. So in that sense, Huck and Lebedev most certainly do belong here. And here we have the most dominant decades for cruiserweights. Huck tops the list, and that's from the current decade. Then comes Lebedev, also current. Then we have Jean-Marc Mormick, O'Neal Bell, and Steve Cunningham, all from the Double O's. Anaclet Wamba from the 90s. Johnny Nelson from the 2000s. And then a tie with Nate Miller and Johan Pablo Hernandez. Again, in terms of being recognized as one of the very best across the stretch of the entirety of a given decade, these guys all had strong campaigns in the weight class. Only 3 cruiserweights appeared in the top 10 in more than one decade. We have Juan Carlos Gomez from the 90s and Double O's. Then we have Steve Cunningham and Krzysztof Wlodarczyk, both from the 2000s and the current decade. And I think this speaks volumes about the type of longevity you really need in a given weight class in order to earn points under this scoring criteria. And finally, if we add up all the numbers from cruiserweights who landed a top 10 spot in any of the 3 decades we looked at, we get a final result that looks like this. Wlodarczyk is at the top of the list. Then Cunningham, Huck, Lebedev, all guys who spent a long time competing as elite level cruiserweights. When you think of the best cruiserweight of all time, a lot of people usually think of Evander Holyfield. But even if we had a complete data set from the 1980s, Holyfield still wouldn't have topped this sort of a list. When you think of Evander and David Hay and James Toney and Vasily Jarov, Tomas Adamek, so many others, they all usually move to heavyweight sooner or later. And the only reason they tend not to is when they truly lack the frame and size to do so. The cruiserweight division is simply a weight class that seems destined to always be the bridesmaid and never the bride, or something like that. And it kinda sucks, because we frequently get a lot of really great matchups there. And it's also in the weight range where many classic heavyweight greats of yesteryear often competed. Cruiserweight doesn't have a long, rich history of tradition like the light heavyweight division. And of course, it doesn't compare to the heavyweight division, which is the marquee weight class in all of boxing. So there's a lot of talent that passes through cruiserweight, but not many hang around there for the long haul. And with that in mind, I think this is actually a pretty good list in the context of what we're trying to do here. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Please stay tuned for more by-decade breakdowns of other weight classes in the near future, with the light heavyweight division coming up next. Until then, have a great night.